So it was the first day of spring 2021, and on this particular day, it was colder than it had been all winter long. I remember hearing the weatherman on the news while I got ready for work calling for a nor'easter, 8 to 12 inches of snow. That sent a lot of people into panic. But myself being a heavy equipment operator and snowplow operator, snow was gold to me, so I was pretty excited. I remember standing out in front of the house waiting for my ride. My boss used to pick me up and give me a ride to work. And as I stood out in front of the house smoking my joint, I remember the brick ice cold wind. It ripped through my clothes, all three layers of my clothes like a samurai sword. It hurt. I get to the machine. It was already running for me. It was a 966 loader, already running. And by the time I got to the machine, the snow was already starting to accumulate and stick to the ground. So I got in my machine, got settled in, and head off on my route like I usually do. I plowed a neighborhood around Boston, Massachusetts. And about an hour into the route, I noticed that the roads we couldn't keep up with the snow. The snow was coming down harder, and the conditions were almost nearing impassable. We tried to keep up with it for another 4 to 5 hours, and that's when I noticed that there was radio silence. There was no CB radios. None of my other operators were on the radios. Um, and the storefronts, the snow was starting to pile up. The snow drifts were piling up on the storefront windows. And so at this point, I tried to call my wife to make sure she was okay and that our house was okay. And there was no service. There was no cell signal. And even the AM and FM radio dials, they were out of service. So I was alone out there, in whiteout conditions, and the snow was just coming down harder and harder and harder. I mean, we passed the 8 to 12 inch mark, within the first 6 hours of the storm. So I'm a little nervous now. I can't get a hold of my wife. Got no CB radio communications. I make a decision to head towards the direction of my apartment, and check on my family. I get to my house, and the snow is up above the front door, and just barely I can see through the top windows of my apartment. I didn't see any lights on. There's usually a hallway light that I can see through that window, and it wasn't on. And the doors and everything were piled, so the only thing I could think of to do is to take that loader and drive it through the front of the house. I threw that bucket in that front window, and I remember curling and ripping the frame of the house with the bucket of that machine, just enough so I could get in. And when I ran in the door, or the door that I made, per se, I remember just looking for my wife and child, screaming for them, in our small apartment. Living room was empty, and when I walked into the bedroom, um, it was full of snow. The windows were already blown out, and my wife and my daughter were huddled in the corner. My wife attempting to keep our child warm the best she could. Um, but hypothermia was setting in, and I had to get them out of there. So I grabbed them both, and I loaded them into my loader with me, and figured I'd head west, away from the storm, and I used my little gas station dashboard compass, and pinned it on west, and I head west for as far as I could, at least until I got to better weather. But that never came. I made it to the highway, the main highways, and it was nothing. It was a field of whipped cream, is what it looked like. Uh, and It was 20 to 40 feet deep, the snow. I began tunneling with my machine, and I remember looking back and seeing thousands of cars behind me. Almost like everyone in New England was trying to follow me out of Boston. But I got to the highway, or where I thought the highway was, and I started digging a tunnel. It was cold enough outside where it wasn't thawing out. The top stayed frozen, and I started tunneling. Bucket by bucket, I tunneled through, just praying to find a way through and get my family to safety. I had to have been plowing in there and taking buckets of snow for 8 hours until I realized my machine was running out of fuel. I was running out of time. I looked behind me. The cars that were behind me before, they held back to see if I'd make it, I guess, because they weren't behind me like they were before. And it was dark. That tunnel got really dark when those lights died and that engine died. But through the corner of my eye and through the side of the banking of my tunnel, I saw the back of an MBTA commuter bus. And it ran on diesel fuel as well as my machine. So I siphoned what I could into my machine, and it got me to about a half of a tank. I continue the mission. I keep bucket by bucket by bucket in this narrow, dark tunnel of snow that could fall on me at any moment. And I charged for another 6 hours. My wife and my child still unconscious from hypothermia from their injuries, their cold weather injuries. And again, after about 6 hours, I feel the machine start to clunk, 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 and it's a sure sign that I'm running out of fuel again. And this time, it didn't look like I was as lucky as I was the last time. The machine dies, and at this point, I figure this is the end for me. This is my end. And with a hope and a prayer, I cranked that motor over one last time. And I ranked that stick and pulled up as high as I could. And God would have it that daylight breaks through. And I see daylight through the top of the snow tunnel. I climb out. I cry with my wife and daughter. And I see miles of traffic and cars and emergency personnel, and they all rescue. They grab us and they put us in the ambulance. And as we drive off, I remember looking back at what used to be New England, but now it's just an iceberg. I really hope they rebuild that place, make it a better place.